Hey everybody, my name is Sam Dawkins, and this past week we continued our sermon series in the warehouse called Things I Wish Jesus Never Said, where we're taking some of the hard teachings of Jesus and seeing how they apply to our lives today. And this past week we talked about how Jesus addresses conflict. A lot of times when we talk about Jesus being very peaceful and very joyous. What we find in this passage from Matthew chapter 10, verses 34 through 37, is that the message that Jesus calls his disciples to bring to other people will sometimes bring conflict and tension into people's lives. But one of the things we learn from this passage is that Jesus doesn't bring a sense of peace at the expense of the truth. If you've ever had someone in your life who was doing something that was destructive to their lives, you may know what I'm talking about. Because in those situations, we have one of two choices. We can either ignore it and hope that it fixes itself, but while that may keep the peace for a little bit, it really doesn't bring any true peace to the situation. You see, that person is still doing something that's destructive to themselves. We're still worried about them. It really isn't good for anybody. And the second option that we have is to address them and to speak the truth in love. And even though we may risk the relationship, even though it may bring up some conflict in our lives, at least we make that person respond to the truth. And that's what Jesus is doing here. He's entered into a world that is on a path to destruction, and he's bringing a truth to them that he wants them to respond to. And he's calling his disciples to do that. And another thing that we see in this passage of Scripture is that when we follow Jesus fully, the only opinion that matters is God's. You see, whenever you follow a calling from Jesus or a calling from God, you often will hear a lot of voices that kind of talk against that calling. We saw this with Noah when he was building the ark, and people were wondering, why is he building an ark in the middle of the land? And Moses when he was leading the people out of Egypt into the wilderness, and then wondering why they kept walking in the wilderness for years and years and years. But whenever God calls us to do something, we are called to follow through that regardless of what other voices say. And so Jesus has called us to go out into the world and proclaim this message of truth. And even though there may be voices in our lives that will speak against that, even though they may come from some of our loved ones who have the best intentions, but they may be speaking against God's will, we are called to always follow that calling that God has placed upon our lives.